Dear friends, sorry that I cannot be with you in person in this event that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. Not exactly the event of the release of the book now, but the release of the book, Darker Nations, which I wrote 20 years ago about the Third World Project, and which at its heart had, of course, the Bandung Conference of 1955, whose 70th anniversary we're celebrating now. At the heart of that book is Indonesia, because in a sense, the Third World Project begins with Sukarno's speech at Bandung in 1955. So I've been waiting for a Bhasha Indonesian edition of the Darker Nations for a very long time, and I very much want to thank our friends at GDH for translating the book, publishing the book, and now having this event. I want to greet friends in Indonesia who keep alive the Bandung spirit, want to extend the Bandung spirit to build for us a political and a social and cultural platform of the global south that is very needed, very important in this moment. I'm very grateful as well that the book has come out in the year of the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference at the institute that I direct, Tricontinental. We have just brought out a dossier called the Bandung Spirit, which tries to reflect on 70 years after the Bandung Conference. So, just first some comments on the book itself, then perhaps on the dossier and the importance of this 70th year anniversary of the Bandung Conference and where the Bandung spirit is now. See, I wrote the book over 20 years ago, The Darker Nations, because I was very concerned that the history of the attempt to build a non-aligned or a third world project had been entirely erased. The debt crisis of the 1980s, the real push against the emergence of sovereign states in Africa, Asia, Latin America, that push that was coming from the global north states from the 1980s, but then hardening in the 1990s, was making generations forget about the importance of this attempt to build sovereignty in the third world. The third world as a concept itself was becoming discolored. It was being treated as a negative, a net negative. And so I start the book by saying the third world is not a place, it's a project. And of course, what is the project? Well, to understand the project of the third world, you really have to go and look at the Bandung Communique at the end of the Asian African Conference of 1955. The text that was produced was really a very sophisticated distillation of the Bandung principles of the Bandung project, of the Third World Project. In other words, it was about having a political independence, certainly, but political independence by itself was not seen as sufficient. After all, Indonesia was independent by 1945. India was independent in 47. Pakistan was independent in 47. Sri Lanka 48. Eventually, the Gold Coast, which had dominion status in 51, would be independent by the end of the decade. More and more countries were getting independence. So independence was already on the table, already part of the agenda in terms of political independence. Economic independence was complicated. In 1965, 10 years after Bandung, Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, writes a book called Neocolonialism, where he begins to argue against the concept of flag independence, saying, well, you can be independent politically, but economically, neo-colonial structures still strangle these countries. You're still exporting raw materials, you're still importing finished products. The terms of trade are decidedly against you. Is it possible to create economic sovereignty? That was a serious issue. Is it possible to create cultural sovereignty. Countries were still sort of looking to the West for inspiration about all kinds of things, music, ideas, and so on. They didn't even know what each other was doing. So cultural sovereignty, not sovereignty in a narrow sense of, we want to be a sovereign, look inward, but sovereignty in terms of, also a third world sovereignty, so that people in India would know the books being published in Indonesia, the ideas being debated and discussed, and so on. So this idea of sovereignty of the third world was key to the project that was being envisaged. It was very much anti-racist and, in a certain sense, anti-imperialist. And the book attempts to sort of put together this project to give it life. And I had to find a way to write this book so that I could talk about a range of developments around the world, but also go into depth in this or that country, telling a little bit of their own story. Well, the important part of the book wasn't just the existence of the project, but its pitfalls, the problems that it inherited. Colonial borders, for instance. It inherited serious problems of poverty. How to overcome this? Because the colonizer had taken the wealth. The Netherlands, such a small population, was richer than Indonesia. How is that possible? Belgium, such a small population, small country. The Congo, 80 times the size of Belgium, but much poorer than Belgium. They stole the wealth. This had a serious problem. And partly it was this that forced the third world to trip up in the 1980s with the debt crisis. And then the sort of magic of the possibility of sovereignty began to dissipate. It didn't revive. And for a very long time, from the 80s to the mid 2000s, mid years of the first decade of the 21st century, it appeared that, it was over. The West had triumphed and, things were not going to develop. But then new objective forces came into play. The countries of Asia, particularly China, to some extent India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, suddenly saw high growth rates. This was the industrial heart of the world. Indonesia selling nickel to these countries began to benefit as an exporter of raw materials, although not yet fully industrializing. What's the industrial policy? Industrialization back on the table. So, in a sense, the global south revives the atmosphere of Bandung 70 years ago, of the Third World Project. Objectively, there's a major revival of the Bandung temperament, but objectively, in terms of economic growth and the economic power of these countries. But politically, there's a little lag. These countries don't really have governments that are driven by the people. They have a kind of democracy that's a little tighter. It's a more elite democracy. The elites still not breaking with the West, still looking at the West for some form of appreciation, for acceptance. So objectively, the tendency of a South-South trade bloc and so on has really taken off and become important. But subjectively, there's a lag. Now, there are some places where there are breakthrough developments. There had been in the 1980s during the debt crisis, a revolution in Burkina Faso, at the time Upper Volta, led by Thomas Sankara. Now, just at the same time as there's a kind of caution amongst the countries of the global south, a new revolution starts in Burkina Faso, led by Captain Ibrahim Traore. That is inspirational by itself. The exhaustion of the elite political developments in the global south, the elite moving toward the right in some places pretty rapidly, out of touch with their own populations. Just because they have money, they're able to drive a politics, but out of touch with their own populations. So that's an interesting development. The things we are seeing in Sri Lanka, in Senegal, some new developments in the northern part of Latin America, led by Mexico, a real development of the fourth transformation. earlier led by Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, now by Claudia Scheinbaum. Worth watching. The game is not over. We still have a great, a period ahead of us where the Third World Project is sort of being revived as a Global South project. The role of China very important in this. Elites even in Indonesia having to reconsider whether they should just sell their nickel or they should process it at home. That debate around industrialization, a key debate, for the future of our countries, for the future of our countries, future of our people. This comes down to the question of what are the struggles between the different classes in these societies. Darker Nations doesn't answer all these questions. It was published, after all, first in 2007. There was a second volume, The Poorer Nations, published in 2013, which took the story up to the 2010s. I'm now working on the third volume, the Brighter Nations, from 2007 onwards. And I hope at some point both the Poorer Nations and the Brighter Nations will be available in Bhasha Indonesian for you. I hope that the Darker Nations by itself from GDH Press, very, very happy that you have released this book, and I hope that it produces debates and discussions that people find it useful in their own attempt to think about what's been happening with the third world, now the global south, 70 years after the Bandung conference. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. My best wishes to you and best wishes for the future of Indonesia, a country close to my heart.